Thank you all. Super excited to again join you today to discuss AI. Uh, and we'll dive into some of these topics, how AI is now deeply ingrained in HR, how it is impacting things, what we do. But before I dive in, what is AI? Has anyone ever come and asked you for guidance around what career they should have, your niece, nephew, friend? Have you ever looked at a candidate's resume and said that based on the diversity of experience, they may be good fit over here? What you have done is looked at the pattern matching against the data that you have seen in your past experience. And while there are numerous definitions of I just like to think of it in a very simplistic terms. Being able to analyze large amounts of data at scale and come up with answers which are backed by data. That simple thing is AI. And what has happened over the last few years is the growth of the data. If the last decade was about moving to cloud, while movement to cloud came to make it easy to deploy software, really what it enabled is access to data. The amount of data that got generated in the last 18 months is more than the data that got generated in the entire history prior to that. Many of you are probably tweeting, posting on Facebook, LinkedIn right now. With every interaction, you're generating data. You're sharing about yourself and other things, what your interests are, what excites you. It's all about data. And now we want to be able to make sense out of that data at a scale, right? And to solve for that, actually AI is already everywhere. I won't go into too many details because we are here more to hear from Craig. But has any one of you ever gotten a CAT scan, MRI, you or your friends or family members, right? Hopefully all they are fine, but what do you do? I mean, you can't cut open the human body to see inside it, actually. There is no real imaging going on. What you are doing is sending thousands and thousands of X-rays through the human body, looking at the patterns over there and using that to reconstruct the human body. And at some level, you never know what is truth, right? But over the years, you have built the confidence that what it is doing is right. And how that is changing a self-driving car. And I'll just give you one funny story on that. My wife was complaining, Ashu, why are you using autopilot in your car? You should never use it. And I asked her simply, who do you think is a safer driver, me or my car? Let's not go into the answers to that one. Or the fact when you do a Zoom call today, video conferencing, the reason why reception is so good on the other side is the extreme compression that is happening, which is powered by AI. So AI is already everywhere. When you go to Google, this is one application that I myself worked on a lot. The reason why Google is able to find the most relevant document out of those trillions of documents is because it is able to understand what you are looking for. And when it comes to employment, growing up in India, all I knew is that if I like math, I can become an engineer. If I like biology, I can become a doctor, and that's it. But then slowly you learn that there are few other paths that exist, right? You can become investment banker and data scientist and so on. But if you dig deep in, what you realize that actually there are so many more roles that are possible. But to be able to do all that at a scale and understand all that at scale, you really need to be able to make sense out of the data. And that is where AI comes in. And Today at Eightfold, we are learning from more than 1 billion people. Because as we move to cloud, all the data is available and accessible. So you can learn about every skill and every role. And what it also enables, now this is the very interesting thing. And I don't know, has anyone of you seen the article about Google and AI over the last 2-3 days? How the deep learning models are almost on the language side becoming like human beings, right? Well, I won't go into the debate of whether that is really human intelligence or not. But because you're learning from the data at a scale, even at Eightfold, we are able to solve this problem across languages that I have no idea what they mean, across roles and proficiencies that I personally have no idea what they mean, but because I can learn from the data. And especially when it comes to HR, quite a few times when we think of AI, we think of, okay, AI is all about matching. Is this person a good fit for this job? Well, that is true, but what is a job? What is a person? Well, I gave you a resume, but someone has to parse it. And in that resume, someone said that I'm a software engineer, level 3. Well, what does that level 3 means? So it's all about from skills understanding to jobs intelligence to matching to how you think of the career pathing of the people end to end. So AI plays a role everywhere, not just in one part. And now, with this great technology comes great responsibility as well, right? And number of things one has to do. I'm sure ethics about AI are top of the mind thing for many of you, right? And that is where we'll talk to Craig a lot about that stuff, right? But whether you start thinking about equal opportunity algorithms, how do you ensure that all algorithms, when they're learning from the data, are not going to perpetuate the bias of that data? And when you're learning from the limited amount of data, they will still do a good job, right? How can you build tools and technologies on top of current systems? So a simple example is masking the profiles. Why do you need to know the name of the candidate to see whether you want to make an offer to that person or not? But guess what? There is no system in the world today that allows you to apply for a job without your name. Please give us your name and email address and phone number, right? How do you think of the role calibration? A very simple stats, if you are looking for a data scientist who know language Python, only 15% of those are women. But if you change the requirement from Python to language R, that number changes to 30%. And more often than not, that's a benign ask. You don't even realize that by making that ask, you're changing the talent pool you're going after. And then you have to make sure that you are both following the laws of the land and also putting all guardrails in place so that your AI is doing the right things, whether it is 4/5 rule, whether it is perturbation test, whether it is AUC, ROC curve, precision recall analysis, F1 matrix, and so on. With that, switching to Craig. Welcome, Craig, first of all. Can you please share your experience a little bit? What is this OFCCP and what you did over there?
Thank you, Ashu. I am always fascinated by the presentation. It really is incredible. You know, OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at the U.S. Department of Labor, regulates federal contractors, enforces affirmative action, or in Europe, typically called positive action, and also equal treatment and non-discrimination in employment for the 25,000 federal contractors in the United States, most of the largest companies in the world. And OFCCP's mission is to use fairly sophisticated techniques. You could put on there OFCCP economists too, because at the agency, we had many economists and analysts who would assess a contractor's workforce using double regression analysis, multiple regression analysis, to assess whether there are disparities in pay or hiring based on either race and ethnicity or gender, and looking to see where those disparities exist to more than 2 standard deviations, how to correct that. OFCCP does about 1,000 audits a year and also publishes a lot of guidance to companies on how to practice non-discrimination and affirmative action in employment. And the executive order that it's based on, Executive Order 11246 from 1965, President Lyndon Johnson, was the basis for positive action in Europe to some extent. And it's cited often as an example of a very positive development that helped lead to greater equal treatment and higher representation of women and minorities in employment in the United States. So that's what I did for several years, and now at K&L Gates, I'm a partner, and I practice in this area and advise companies all the time on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs. And I'm also on the Eightfold Advisory Board, and I talk to Eightfold all the time about these issues to make sure that this is a cutting-edge company doing top-of-the-line work on artificial intelligence and connecting the right person to the right job, but they care as deeply as doing that in a compliant way, a lawful way, a way that respects these incredibly important concepts of equal treatment and non-discrimination.
And one interesting thing, as we were doing our fundraising a few years back, one of the investors was like, we want to make sure what you guys are doing is indeed above the law, right? And here is an expert, Craig, why don't you talk to him? And as I talked to him, I was like, not only Craig is someone who's extremely experienced in law, but also extremely passionate about this space. So thank you, Craig, for helping us over the years now.
Oh, my pleasure.
Us.
It's
So
really great to be
with
here.
your experience in US, right, what's the difference between the European laws and US laws when it comes to these principles of equal opportunity?
Well, they're fairly similar, to be honest. Both the EU law and the EU treaty, with the focus on equal treatment and non-discrimination based on numerous protected classes, race and gender being two of the principal ones, but also disability status, which is another area we look at when you're assessing equal treatment and non-discrimination to make sure that there's not either disparate treatment or disparate impact based on people with disabilities. The United States has extraordinarily similar laws in that regard, both in terms of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Executive Order from 1965, and the Americans with Disabilities Act from the early 90s. And laws that have developed from that, there is striking similarity between Europe and the United States in this regard. I'd say the underlying concept that ties everything together on both sides of the Atlantic is the concept of equal opportunity, and the idea that everyone should have that same chance at a job, and that decisions should be based on merit and merit alone, and never based on someone's protected class status.
And how does Eightfold AI fits into these European laws, European Charter?
Yeah, so the benefit of using artificial intelligence, let me give you one example in particular why I think it's so critical. Studies show that unconscious bias permeates a lot of decisions that are made by employers, particularly when you're dealing with large numbers of people, that it's almost impossible to eliminate unconscious bias, even with very advanced unconscious bias trainings that talk about affinity bias, anchoring bias, all the various forms of bias that can come in. Even though we've been talking about that now for many years, studies still show that there will be a slight difference between how men and women are treated, how minorities and non-minorities are treated because of unconscious bias. Well, artificial intelligence addresses that directly and really is the gold standard, the standard of care, in terms of having artificial intelligence and human decision makers working together. Ashu talked about profile masking. That's extraordinarily important. And I'm also a professor, an adjunct professor at George Washington University. Students now, if you ask a student, how do you want to be graded, students will generally tell you they prefer that their grading is masked, that you don't know their identity, because you're solely looking at the work product and making a determination as to who would be best. That's the same in employment. It's almost always better to not know when you're making that initial assessment of qualifications and things like that, not to know the person and not to know their identity. Because even if you as an individual may not be biased, what the stats show and what the evidence show is that when you're making 1,000 of these decisions with maybe 30 or 40 decision makers over time, there will be bias. And that's why the artificial intelligence helps with that. It's incredibly important. You mentioned autonomous vehicles. I used to be a local government attorney. Autonomous vehicles is the way of the future. In the United States, there's a lot of thinking that eventually you will not be able to get a driver's license in most instances because the standard of care will be the autonomous vehicle, and it'll be part of a system that works together. And if you have some human decision maker who's making decisions that aren't necessarily rational within that system, it could cause accidents. And so you'll probably have to get a special driver's license. I would say the same with artificial intelligence in employment. It will be the standard of care. I would be surprised in a decade if the law won't support the notion that you really need to have artificial intelligence as part of your employment processes, because if you don't, then you're relying wholly on human decision makers, knowing that unconscious bias exists, and that's going to be a problem. So I see artificial intelligence becoming more and more integrated into employment decision making.
And do you think as part of that, can enterprises do something with AI to build better trust with candidates?
Yes. One thing that I love about Eightfold as well is that candidates can see their profiles. That's extraordinarily important, the transparency that's involved in this process. So if there's something that's incorrect about it, the person can reach out and correct that. So there's transparency on both sides. And ultimately, the goal is to get the most meritorious person into the job that they're going to do the best at. And yes, I think that that's helpful to people. Like, for example, let's say you're a person, my daughter has very profound autism, and I work a lot in the disability community with autistic individuals. If you look at classic, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities, for people with autism is higher than the general unemployment rate. The labor force participation rate is lower. A lot of times, if you look at a traditional resume by a candidate and you know they're autistic and you're looking at this, or you interview them and they don't give you eye contact, for example, which is sometimes happens with autistic individuals, or they have anxiety in the interview process, you may not hire them. Even though if you look at some of the experiences they've had, they could be extraordinarily strong candidates. AI is more likely to identify that than a human decision maker, unless you've trained that human decision maker in autism, and that they shouldn't look for some of the classic goals of an interview. Eye contact and confidence in an interview is something that a lot of companies look at and will often use that as a proxy for other things. But that can discriminate against people with disabilities. That can discriminate against people with accents. That can discriminate against anyone that's not, in your mind, the norm in this particular area, and that's what unconscious bias is. So artificial intelligence will help that employee get a job, get the right job, because it's going to be looking solely at their skills and their qualifications.
Ajay, that's interesting because when I was starting, one of the big challenges that I ran into was, if you want to be a CEO, you need to be an extrovert. And a little secret, while I'm here right now, I'm just dreading it. But actually, over time, the data has shown that introverts make better CEOs. And it's really our own biases that come in, right? And thank you for sharing about your daughter.
Of course.
What about workers' council and privacy things like GDPR? What are those obligations, and how should enterprises think about that?
Well, Eightfold is looking at that all the time. They have a compliance division. They want to make sure to, it differs to some extent between countries on privacy laws and things like that, and it's something that is, important to be mindful of. But, again, AI is used all the time. I don't think people realize how often AI is used. Any job board, for example, where you're putting in criteria and it's identifying candidates for you, is using AI. And in the United States, a number of localities and states have passed laws relating to AI, including New York, most famously, has a very comprehensive one. You want to, in my opinion, you want to go to a company like Eightfold that cares about compliance, that leans into it, that is testing for bias and disparate impact all the time. I mean, you mentioned like 5 or 6 different indicators of potential bias that Eightfold tests for. One, of course, you want to make sure that in any given situation, let's say you have applications from men and from women, you want the AI provider to be testing whether there is bias that could be creeping in by running many different permutations, many different tests, and let's say 500 times, and see, well, does the male candidate do as well as the female candidate if they have the same qualifications? So you're doing that. You're looking to see if there's any bias in that regard. Two, you mentioned that in some areas you may see, based on historical trends or even discrimination sometimes, that men and women might have different qualifications, and like, for example, in terms of availability. So you mentioned Python, that women are less likely to have experience in Python, just based on the trends and history and availability analysis. Well, what's interesting, and one thing that OFCCP looks at is, well, let's say you're a woman and you're applying for Python. You're applying for a job and you have Python. Will you be treated fairly to a male candidate who applies, even though more males apply for this? And there may be an unconscious bias that, men are generally in this area. OFCCP doesn't necessarily require that 50% of the people you employ be women and 50% men, if availability is 85% men, 15% women, but they do expect that you're hiring about 15% women. And so, what you often see in those circumstances, though, is that women have a harder time getting the job because of the unconscious bias. So, anyhow, I've mentioned several things in response to your question, but, that sort of thinking is called disparate impact, and looking to see whether the unconscious bias or some of these requirements are harming women or harming minorities. And Eightfold does that as well. One great thing about using AI is that you're looking at qualifications all the time, so you can validate your decision-making process. And another thing with Eightfold is that you can test for disparate impact or bias in real time. You can run tests weekly, you can run tests quarterly, you can run tests in real time. A lot of companies only do that annually, so you're always looking for bias. In terms of privacy itself, I mean, again, usually the issue in that is, one, do you get to see your profile to make sure that it reflects you? Two, are you using a program that's protected from hacking or things like that, of course? And then three, on the other side, can there be profile masking to make sure that you're not being discriminated against? So Eightfold looks at all of those things, and in my mind, again, that would be the gold standard. That's what you would want. You'd want to have your resume, your qualifications assessed by AI, because that gives you the best chance to be identified if you're the most meritorious candidate.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
So with AI, there is a perception of... Thank you. With the AI, there is a perception of lack of transparency within the decision-making process itself that is automated or, debiased, so to speak, by the AI. How do you tackle that concern alongside all the other problems and opportunities?
No, absolutely. I think that's a very important question. And AI explainability has to be front and center into everything that AI is doing. As Craig mentioned, right, giving candidates a visibility into how they are being assessed, what data about them is being looked at by the enterprise, and then both to the recruiter and the hiring manager giving visibility into how AI is interpreting their data and the jobs data is extremely important. And I think outside the regulations and the test and control, explainability needs to be front and center.
Yeah, and so typically you look at two things. One, is the AI working? Is it identifying strong candidates? At least in the industry, Eightfold is very highly regarded in that way. That's why many companies use its platform, because it helps identify the top candidate. That's also a way to validate under legal constructs. The way to validate the AI is to show that you're getting good candidates, and a lot of times the market will take care of that. If a particular platform is not identifying strong candidates, it won't succeed. So that's one thing. Two, the regulators are mostly interested. They understand that there is to some degree, there's obviously an algorithm that's looking at this, that's helping to assess the data and identify the important points. What regulators are concerned about is, one, does that cause bias? Is it looking at men better than women? Is it looking at non-minorities as stronger than minorities or something like that? Is there a bias in there? Or vice versa. It's looking at bias both ways. you don't want bias, and that's why it's important to test for it. That's what the New York law says. They want to show that there's not going to be, if you run 1,000 tests, that it's not going to benefit, it should be 50-50 basically. It's like a coin flip. If you see that the coin is tainted, that's a problem. So that's one thing you want to make sure that any AI user has a compliance division that's looking at bias. And then two, and really the more complex question is disparate treatment or indirect discrimination, as it's often referred to in Europe. And so what they're going to want to show is that if a particular AI is leading to, in a particular situation, let's say, for example, it identifies more male candidates than female candidates in a particular position, well, you want to know why. Well, why? What qualification caused that? Was it a lifting requirement? Was it a height requirement, which can sometimes have a disparate impact against women? Okay, well then is that necessary? The nice thing about, the good thing about Eightfold's AI is what the factors are that were considered, and in fact, they can even tell you how it will impact your applicant pool. So if you have a height requirement of 6 feet, it may end up leading to, and I don't know the exact numbers, but 80% of the availability being men in that particular situation. But if you change it to 5'8", it may be closer to 50-50. It may be 60% men, 40% women. And then you can look at, well, do we really need a 6-foot height requirement for this particular job as opposed to a 5'8"? Or do we need a 100-pound lifting requirement as opposed to 25 pounds? And you'll see that by changing it to 25 pounds, that you'll end up having a much greater applicant pool of women. So I would argue that the AI, like Eightfold's platform, allows you to assess that in a way that really hasn't been possible before. It was more human decision makers sort of eyeballing the situation and saying, well, I think we need this lifting requirement. I'm not exactly sure how that impacts our applicant pool, how it will impact women in employment. But, we think we can justify it. Now you have a tool that will show you precisely how much of an impact that will have on your labor force, on people with disabilities, on women. And making sure that you can increase applicant flow, which is ultimately the goal of positive action. You want more people to be able to apply, and then you want to identify them based on merit. And that's the goal of Eightfold's platform. So
I know this is a
we
topic.
used all the time. I apologize.
This is a topic we can go on and on. But thank you, Craig, for sharing your thoughts today, and thank you for the audience. We'll be around. So during lunch and evening cocktail hours, happy to answer any questions you may have.